The 19th century is also well known as the Victorian era, which was a time known for rapidly accelerating scientific discovery and invention. During this time, the Industrial Revolution occurred, and the Victorian era was notorious for the employment of young children in factories and mines. This was also the time period in which the world was fully discovered, as the last parts of the world were mapped by the Europeans. Slavery was also common throughout this era. The jobs of the Victorian era were extremely divided between those of the upper class and those of the lower class. Because the conditions of the lower class were so harsh, the children were forced into labor as well. Child labor was a prevalent problem of that time. For example, there were the climbing boys employed with the chimney sweeps, boys and girls working down the coal mines, crawling through tunnels too narrow and low to take an adult. Some children worked as errand boys, crossing sweepers, shoeblacks, and they sold matches, flowers, and other cheap goods. Most households drew money from various sources, with many women and juveniles adding to wage earning, even if their employment was usually more intermittent and low-paid than that of adult males. Due to the high birth rates and improvement of life expectancy, Victorian families were very large and more than 10 children per family were common. Although it was never common in Britain for families to consist of more than 2 generations or contain more than one husband-wife partnership, there became a tendency for grandparents to live in households that had young children. Men were expected to provide for their family, which was the rise of the idea of the breadwinner husband and the domestic wife ideals. When husbands died, widows often had to work, usually pushing them towards prostitution. Servants were excluded from the family at this time, leading to the ideals of family including only the father, mother, and dependent children. In most families, all the resources would go to the eldest son, although some equally distributed the resources among the children. During the Victorian era, marriage transitioned from arranged to those based on love and affection. This idea took hold first among the urban, educated, wealthy, and middle class. Rural Americans adapted to this ideal later. It was still common for the wealthy to marry the wealthy and the poor to marry the poor. Women were expected to remain innocent and pure until marriage, whereas men were allowed to have premarital sexual relationships. They married as an act of survival, as many could not support themselves due to societal norms and had to depend on men's money, whether it be their fathers or husbands. Upon marriage, women were completely under the supervision of their husbands by law, meaning that everything belonged to the man, including the children, any money the wife earned, and any property she acquired. Also, beatings and marital rape were considered legal back then, as men had all the power over the women. Basic structure of the social hierarchy of the Victorian era consisted of an upper class, middle class, and working class. Industrialization brought along an increasing middle class population that had a significant effect on the social strata. For example, in the middle class home, privacy was very much valued. The concept of privacy became a hallmark of the middle class life. The middle class home was dark, curtained off, wary of intrusion, and opened only by invitation on occasions such as parties or teas. Inside and outside of the home took up lots of time, and working people had far less leisure time. Popular forms of entertainment varied by social class. The upper class was interested in theater, literature, opera, music, and the arts. However, oftentimes gentlemen of the upper class would use their money to go gambling, drink, and hire prostitutes. The middle and lower class could share some of the same leisures. They did not have as much time as the upper class. Some activities they shared were visiting the seaside and attending spiritual lectures. The bourgeois respectability refers to the society's ideals during the Victorian era. These ideals include financial success, upward social mobility, freedom from financial debt, and a stable family that follows the traditional patriarchal lines. The idea that women had no economic or political power supported this patriarchy, causing them to be completely dependent on the men that they were with. This ideal was never challenged during the time it prevailed, and by the time Ibsen wrote his challenge of this ideal through A Doll's House, people had already begun to question them. The women's rights movements brought on a lot of fear as the bourgeois respectability ideal was all that people had known for almost a century.